So to be honest, I'm coming this morning with a little bit of trepidation. In part because much of what I want to visit with you this morning is about the tragedy unfolding now in Israel and Palestine. I'm probably much like you have watched the horror of the past week, the violence and bloodshed in Israel and Gaza. And I come to speak, I must confess, in trepidation in part because personally I know so little about the region. Haven't ever actually been to the Middle East. Much of my knowledge, much like yours, is seen and heard on television or social media through the prism of pundits interpreting the causes and reasons for the conflict. And I must confess, I am indicted by my own ignorance, apathy up to this point, about the realities that are unfolding before our very eyes. And I come with trepidation this morning because I know enough of church history to know our long acts as Christians of anti-Semitism, our unending history of persecutions of Jews as a church. I come with trepidation because I bear, like all of us, the generational trauma of the Holocaust, where a nation of Christians, primarily Christians, killed millions of Jews. And I come with trepidation this morning because of the enormity of the pain and the violence unfurling halfway around the world. And I must confess, as watching those events unfold, wrestling with this, I come wondering if I should even speak of it in my sermon to you. What insights do I actually have to offer? What word can be preached by someone who knows so little and is so safely ensconced away in the suburbs of West Des Moines? And really, what does the gospel have to say to us, even and especially in these tragic days? Now, this past week, I had the joy of holding my 5-month-old grandson. And those grandparents here, of whom I'm a new member, know the joy of that. Looking into their eyes, celebrating the miraculousness of their life, that tiny little life. But looking at him this week, news on the background about Palestine and Israel, and I could not help but imagine an Israeli grandmother holding her granddaughter as the attacks occurred, or a Palestinian grandfather holding his grandson while bombs fall around his home. Their story is one we don't often hear, nor have we heard. So finally, I realized I come with trepidation to speak about what is happening halfway around the world, in part because the important part of the gospel is to speak the truth, to wrestle with those realities, to speak a truth which has generally in our modern world today been polarized into competing camps, often depending on one's own polarized political perspective. Which side are we supposed to believe? And more importantly, probably the most important question, it is, what is the just and peaceful way forward? Now, someone shared with me just this week a blog by Rabbi Brant Rosen, and he had this really interesting observations to make. He writes, "It is not an understatement to suggest that the Jewish community is now faced with a profound moral challenge. He writes, even as we mourn our dead in Israel, we must acknowledge and protest the genocide Israel is currently perpetuating in their memory in no uncertain terms. And I cannot, Rabbi Rosen, I cannot say this forcefully enough. Those of us who ignore this reality, who mourn Jewish dead exclusively without even a mention of the massive crimes Israel is actively committing against the Palestinian people, as he puts it, will be quite frankly complicit in this horrific bloodshed. And maybe if we don't wrestle with the question, we too are complicit. Now, it's a good reminder to me that neither side is monolithic in its perspective. There are Jewish and Israeli people who believe different things about that context of what is going on, and the same is true of Palestinians. Not all Palestinians are Hamas or Hezbollah. Not every Jew and Israeli agrees on the bombing of Gaza. It's a reminder that war is ultimately a failure, let's be honest, of leadership. And let's be honest as well that it has been said that the first casualty of war is truth. So I don't know about you, but the words of Paul this morning actually seem so empty. In a world filled with ethnic cleansing, with the violence we've seen, be nice. Really can't really speak to what's happening now. Forgiveness, it seems an impossible reality. Love and harmony, that belongs in children's songs, right? Not now in the Gaza Strip. What possible worth can be heard in these meager words spoken in the darkness of hundreds of thousands of people now cut off from electricity, from food and medicine? Bear with one another. Bear with one another. The Greek word to bear is to hold up, to hold onto, both physically, both mentally, and both spiritually. To bear one another is to hold on to the other in your arms, in your mind, and in your soul. I have this image of lifting up someone, carrying someone when they cannot walk or when they cannot move themselves. Paul writes, set your mind on Christ. If you've been raised with Christ, born by Christ, held by Christ, carried by Christ, seek the things that are above where Christ is. See the world as Christ does. Now, one way to think about this, one way to put this in this world, which would divide us, it would, and tries, into polarized camps unable to listen or hear each other, unable to bear with one another. I suspect seeing Christ means we bear that division, that polarization within our own hearts, within our own minds, and within our own souls. As painful and hard as that is to imagine. That we are called to bear and hold both Israelis and Jews and Palestinians, to bear them together. And I think Paul understood something. Paul understood first and foremost, he knew and reminds us that this is really what it starts with, is a spiritual struggle. It starts, that struggle, in our own hearts and in our own minds and in our own souls, and we're supposed to hold them there, as painful and as difficult as that might be. One might say that all wars begin and end in the heart and soul of every human being. That it starts and ends with us. One of my favorite writers was a Trappist monk named Thomas Merton. Anybody heard of Thomas Merton? He was a monk who lived in the 50s and 60s, I think into the 70s. And he was famous because he wrote about the spiritual life. But he was also very much engaged in society and culture around him, which was very, those of you who lived through it know how conflicted, how polarizing it was in our country at that time. And one of my favorite quotes from him, when he was asked one time, does the spiritual life, meaning retreating from the world, is that really what we're called as Christians? And he said, oh, quite the opposite, he said. When I go in and when I stay in the monastery, when I pray, when I go deep within myself, what I find in myself are the very seeds of Auschwitz and Watts and the horrific events that occur around us. That if I go deep enough, I find in my own heart those seeds and offer them to God. Peter Armstrong, a theologian, writes, if we Christians claim to have anything to do with Jesus, then we must inherently be engaged with the issues of our time. We need not seek division and further polarization. However, we can continue to engage in tough debate and conversation across dividing lines, expressing our own deeply held convictions and being willing to be changed by our encounter with the other. Because that's the way Jesus engaged with others. Finally, a prayer written by another rabbi, Alyssa Wise. I'll end with that. May the one who remembers allow us to hold in one hand 75 years of occupation, dispossession, and violence, and in the other a future of peace, justice, and freedom. May the one who is slow to anger soften our hearts and our fists, helping us to put down the sword even at the height of the arc of our rage. May the one of possibility remind us that a future of peace with justice is possible. May the one who awakens us to life hold us in our pain and vindictiveness until we set those down for the sake of life. And may the one who endures allow us to act for the sake of the coming generations. And may the one who is without limit expand our senses of what is possible as we search for justice, freedom, and peace for all. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.